Okay, great. Yeah, so this webinar is being recorded. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm gonna wait like a minute or two for folks to trickle in. Feel free to use the chat function and introduce yourself and say where you are. And I will be monitoring the Q&A. And like I said, this is going to be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So feel free to check that out when that's ready. I know up here in San Francisco, there's supposed to be some rain coming this weekend. So maybe other parts of California will get some rain as well. Fingers crossed. Not like an atmospheric river, but just a nice mellow rain.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah, I'm sure all the birds would like it too.
I know this rain's been amazing.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this talk. I don't know really anything about bringing birds to the garden, so I'm really excited to learn a lot. Yeah, this is great to see everybody using the chat function. And like I said, this is being recorded, and feel free to use the Q&A, and I will try to get to all the questions as they come. And if we have time at the end, we'll have some time for live Q&A as well. So I'm gonna stop my share, and then Benny, if you wanna take over sharing your screen, and in the meantime, I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight. So this is Benny Jacobs-Schwartz, and he owns and operates a bird guiding business and lifestyle brand called Birds by Beaches. I think he'll go into that a little bit more. But Benny has been working professionally for over 10 years as a naturalist guide, expedition trip leader, and international bird guide, and has worked in a variety of locations coast to coast, including places such as coastal Alaska, Central America, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Ecuadorian Amazon. And Benny is a passionate educator and photographer specializing in birds. He has a deep love for California native plants, local ecology, and for supporting ecosystem-based approaches to conservation. And he uses his ample collection of nature-based content to leverage an active social media presence. And he uses his passion for the natural world to inspire others to put down their phone and pick up their binos.
That's the truth.
Yeah, take it away, Benny.
Alrighty, well, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Maya. And California Native Plant Society, it's a huge honor to be here. As it turns out, I love birds and native plants, so this is an amazing forum to share a little bit of my love and my knowledge. And like Maya said, if y'all have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and then we'll kind of go through them at the end, time permitting. I hope to keep this thing kind of timely, hopefully about 45 minutes, and about to set my timer right now so I can keep track of myself. So without further ado, I'm Benny. This is California Native Plants, and this is all about an ecosystem-based approach to gardening for native species. Most of the media you'll see in here is mine, unless otherwise indicated. So let's get it going. Alrighty, so Birds by Beaches, a little bit about your speaker. That's me. Hello. Benjamin Isaac Jacobs-Schwartz. My friends and family call me Beaches. If you'd like to find yourself in that category, you can call me Beaches as well. And the whole shtick behind my brand is kind of 3 parts. I do birds, including bird photography and media. I offer local birding and ecology tours in California and mostly in SoCal. And then I also offer international birding tours to the New World tropics. And then I also have clothing. So starting off with the clothing, my whole goal for Birds by Beaches was really, in about 2017, I was getting pretty fired up on birds, and I wanted to kind of shift the paradigm around birds and people who were going birding, because when I came up in the birding scene, it was not a lot of people in my age group. And so I wanted to expand that. And I knew that to attract the attention of my generation and my peers, it had to be cool first. And so that's kind of my approach. And I lead local birding walks. This was at Lake Merritt in Oakland with some friends. And like I said, I also offer international birdwatching tours to the New World tropics like Costa Rica and Ecuador. All right, so first things first. So native plants are amazing. And so often Native people are left out of the conversation, but not tonight. So this is an amazing resource. It's nativeland.ca, and you can find out where you are located and which native land you currently are on. And so I'm currently in Tongva land, so recognizing that this is unceded Tongva land, and this is where I live. And next up, we're going to talk a little bit about Native peoples or Indigenous people or Indians in California, because there's a lot of misconceptions and also a lot of non-information around the topic by non-natives. So what I'm going to read to y'all is some excerpts out of a fantastic anthology called Tending the Wild, and it's pretty incredible. And it's all about California Indigenous people and their role in California. So the New World is in fact a very old world. The mountain forests, broad inland valleys, oak-studded hills, and deserts of the region now called California were thoroughly known, celebrated in story and song, named in great detail, and inhabited long before European explorers sailed along the west coast of North America for the first time. Every day of every year for millennia, the Indigenous people of California interact with the native plants and animals that surround them. This was written in the past tense. Obviously, they still do this. They transform roots, berries, shoots, bones, shells, and feathers into medicine meals, bows, and baskets, and achieved an intimacy with nature unmatched by the modern-day wilderness guide, trained field botanist, or applied ecologist. Going forward, the first European explorers, American trappers, and Spanish missionaries entering California painted an image of the state as a wild Eden, providing plentiful nourishment to its native inhabitants without sweat or toil. But in actuality, the productive and diverse landscapes of California were in part the outcome of sophisticated and complex harvesting and management practices. And also, this is the most boring part in terms of like me reading to you. That's not how this presentation is going to go, but I think it's critical that we go over this. California Indians protect and tend favored plant species and habitats, harvested plant and animal products at carefully worked out frequencies and intensities, and practice an array of horticultural techniques through coppicing, pruning, harrowing, sowing, weeding, burning, digging, thinning, and selective harvesting. They encouraged the desired characteristics of individual plants, increased populations of useful plants, and altered the structures and compositions of plant communities. Regular burning of many types of vegetation across the state created better habitat for game, eliminated brush, minimized the potential for catastrophic fires, and encouraged the diversity of food crops. These harvest and management practices, on the whole, allowed for sustainable harvest of plants over centuries and possibly thousands of years. It's also a reminder that Indigenous people are still here, and they have been here since time immemorial. Like I said, this is a little bit cumbersome, but critical. During the course of their long history in California, Indians so exhaustively explored the plant kingdom for its uses and so thoroughly tested nature's responses to human harvesting and tending that they discovered how to use nature in a way that provided them with a relatively secure existence while allowing for the maximum diversity of other species. In the context of the entire continuum of possible human interactions with nature, ranging from exploitation and human designed environments to hands-off preservation, this relationship between the Indigenous people of California and the natural world represented a middle way, a calculated, tempered use of nature. Tending the Wild explores how California Indians managed economies and occupied this middle portion of the continuum. It recasts them as active agents of environmental change and stewardship, shattering the hunter-gatherer stereotype long perpetuated in the anthropological and historical literature of California. The terms hunter-gatherer and forager are inaccurate anthropological labels assigned to most California Indian groups. They connote a hand-to-mouth existence. They imply also that California Indians dug tubers, plucked berries, and foraged for greens in a random fashion, never staying in any one place long enough to leave lasting human imprints. But as Tending the Wild demonstrates, the Indigenous people of California had a profound influence on many diverse landscapes, in particular the coastal prairies, valley grasslands, and oak savannas, three of the most biologically rich plant communities in California. Without an Indian presence, the European explorers would have encountered a land with less spectacular wildflower displays, fewer larger trees, and fewer park-like forests, and the grassland habitats that today are disappearing in such places as Mount Tam and Salt Point Park might not have existed in the first place. A primary way that we have responded to the loss of biodiversity, the degradation of ecosystems, and the endangerment of particular species is by setting aside land and protecting it from virtually all human influences. The assumptions behind this strategy are apparent in the way that we define wilderness. Much of what we consider wilderness today was in fact shaped by Indian burning, harvesting, tilling, pruning, sowing, and tending. This fact suggests an alternative way of conserving the lands that have so far largely evaded or have somewhat recovered from the impact of modern society. Manage them by applying the traditional ecological knowledge and transitional resource management practices of California Indigenous people. Lastly, although setting aside areas of wilderness is still absolutely necessary given our population numbers, there are compelling reasons to protect, restore, and manage some wild lands by following a model other than the hands-off wilderness model. Under what we call Indigenous management model, we can recreate specific human and ecosystem associations within designated areas and use them to restore and maintain these areas as they were when first visited by non-Indians. David Egan, editor of Ecological Restoration, defines this kind of ecological restoration as the practice of reestablishing historic plant and animal communities of a given area or region and renewing the ecosystem and cultural functions necessary to maintain these communities now and into the future. So thank you for bearing with me while I read that to you, but I think it's important. So just looking at this bar graph, demonstrating what percentage of each of these various ecosystems remain today, as was published back in 95 or 2005. So as you can see, a lot of these habitats have been absolutely devastated through colonization and modern development. One thing that I think is also important to point out is that Indigenous communities are actually incredibly important in terms of protecting all biodiversity, which I think is a huge part of what conservation is aimed at. And so you can see here that they protect about 80% of global biodiversity. World Wildlife Foundation also recognizes that fact to be true. So back to California, here's a map of, a more concrete map of various Indigenous territories throughout the state of California. And like I said, I live in Los Angeles, aka Tovaangar, and the home of the Tongva people. I'm not Indigenous, but it's important to point out what's going on and what has happened here. So getting back into things from a little bit more of a Western science botanical perspective, the Jepson Manual highlights this incredible place called California and the floristic province. And so as you can see here, California is made up of a variety of extremely diverse habitats. The Sierra Nevada range basically runs down the spine of California, and it's a huge reason why we have such incredible diversity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Here's a color key for each of these specific bioregions. Long story short, California hosts over 5,500 species of native plants, and California has around 2,387 species of endemic plants, meaning plants that are found nowhere else on Earth except for California Floristic Province. It's also important to call out that the California Floristic Province extends into northern Baja California. All right. So within the Floristic Province, we have a variety of different organisms or plants, and we're going to define them. So trees are woody perennial plants, typically having a single stem or trunk growing to a considerable height and bearing lateral branches at some distance from the ground. And as you can see, we have about 200 plus species of trees native to California. Next up in size are shrubs. So shrubs are woody plants, which are similar to a tree, and that they actually have several main stems arising at or near the ground. And we have a ton of shrubs in California, everything from ceanothus to manzanita to buckwheat, sages, all kinds of stuff. The next thing that we'll talk about are annuals. So an annual and a perennial can sometimes be interchangeable depending on the latitude and the location and the growing conditions of that specific area. However, for this context, annuals are basically any plant that completes its life cycle in a single growing season. These are typically what we define as wildflowers. The next up that we're going to talk about are perennials, which are basically plants that persist for several years, usually with new fresh growth happening as a part of the plant that survives, growing from season to season. And like I said before, some species of plants, depending on their location, can be annuals or perennials. So as you can see, we have a ton of perennials as well. Moving into grasses. So sometimes people forget about grasses. They're not to be forgotten. They are incredible. And California has lost a lot of our bunch grasses and our native grass species due to agriculture and things like that, land conversion. But basically, grasses are a large family of plants, either in Gramina or Poaceae, and they're monocots, meaning they have a single leaf that comes out initially, and they have narrow leaves, hollow stems, and a cluster of very small with usually wind-pollinated flowers. And then we've got succulents. I think everyone knows what those are. The fleshy tissues adapted to water storage, cactus, dudleya, etc. Joshua tree, we've got a ton. Vines, plants whose stem requires support and that climbs by tendrils or twining or creeps on the ground. Everything from California grape to morning glory, wild cucumber, etc. Ferns, non-flowering plants, they are still plants, but they have vascular structure that possess true roots, unlike many orchids. Then they have stems and complex leaves that reproduce by spores. And in California, we have just over 100 species. All right. So tonight's talk is all about an ecosystem-based approach, right? If you want to attract birds to your garden, that's awesome. And you could probably do that really easily with a bird feeder. But today we're going to talk about it on a much more comprehensive level. And so California plants are incredibly well adapted to the climates that they live in, right? Plants, native plants in California are obviously important. I don't think I need to define why we're all here at a CNPS presentation. That being said, these plants are incredibly resilient. They've been here for thousands of years, and they have incredible adaptations to surviving and persisting in the climates, often harsh climates in which they live. I live in Southern California in Los Angeles, and one of my favorite ecosystems here is chaparral. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of these chaparral plants and their adaptations, which can be extrapolated as an understanding that plants in California are uniquely adapted to survive here. And that's why they're the best fit to live here. So chaparral plants have sclerophyllous leaves, which are generally leathery, waxy, drought tolerant, and often small, and which helps prevent evapotranspiration and keep the plants happy and healthy. Chaparral plants also have deep taproots, which are incredible for erosion prevention, which you see happening during these last atmospheric rivers, areas that have been removed of chaparral plants, a lot of landslides, and soil has been moved. Chaparral plants are also adapted to periodic fires. They create microclimate for moisture retention and for animal protection / habitat. They're extremely resilient where temps can fluctuate between freezing snow and blistering heat. And they produce flowers, fruits, seeds for birds and local wildlife, which can be accessed generally year-round, depending on what time of year it is. And like I said, they've got thick, waxy cuticles like this lemonade berry, and they're drought resistant. And they generally actually flower during this time of the year when the flowering period is during the cooler, wet months. So it's kind of interesting thinking about that. And the main topic here is birds and plants. So chaparral plants are also an incredible natural food and habitat resource. As we can see here, we've got a hermit thrush perching on laurel sumac seeds, which is basically a natural bird feeder. So why birds, right? Why are birds so cool? Well, there's probably like 1,000 reasons. One of the ones that I think is so interesting is that birds are what we call universal, they're ecosystem indicators, and they're universal communicators. And so in terms of ecosystem indication, we use that in a biological sense in that when you're surveying an ecosystem, the higher your species richness indicates how healthy the overall ecosystem is, right? Because everything's connected, right? The birds eat the seeds, the berries, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's all connected. So the healthier an ecosystem is, the more birds you're going to see. The cool thing about birds is either they're there or they're not. They're not nearly as cryptic as a lot of other species like amphibians, which can be really challenging to observe. So birds are a great tool to studying ecosystems as well as ascertaining the overall health. Birds also have a unique language, which is pretty fascinating. It's understood by animals, basically beetles, like beetle or mouse size and larger. That's beyond the scope of tonight's presentation, but it is important to note. So ecosystem-based approach, right? So we want to provide year-round habitat and food resources for birds and other wildlife. And so this is a Williamson sapsucker photographed in San Luis Obispo County eating some coffee berry. So the goal here is attracting birds to the garden. Well, let's talk about that. Part of the reason why using native plants is important is because these birds have actually co-evolved with these plants over thousands of years. This is a Scots oriole out in Joshua Tree area feeding on a Joshua tree. So it's no coincidence these birds and plants love each other and they depend on each other. Native plants also support native wildlife. It's kind of a no-brainer, but it's also something that is important to mention. So like I said before, we're talking about an ecosystem-based approach. And as you can see in a lot of these areas, across California, some of this habitat has been severely fragmented due to development and colonization. The goal of this presentation is to help folks understand that what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between these urban, suburban areas and between the natural spaces that exist so that we can create basically ecosystem sources as well as footholds for species to persist, because many of the plants and animals and insects, etc., in California are threatened, endangered, or have already gone extinct. So where did our birds go is an important question. So I'm sure most folks have heard about this collapse in insects, the collapse in bird populations. It's no coincidence, they're definitely connected. And the long story short is that we're losing habitat as well as important food resources. And so since 1970, we've lost about 3 billion birds. And in terms of migratory birds, about 2.5 billion migratory birds lost since 1970. And 2 in 5 Baltimore Orioles have been lost since 1970. Not losses, we can't find them. They're literally just not here anymore because the habitats have been so degraded and there's not been a serious priority to protect the environment. However, I'm sure you all are here to figure out how to do that. It's also important to note that in California, we exist on the Pacific Flyway, okay? And so many of the birds that we see are either passage migrants, winter visitors, or in fact live here year round. Many of the birds that pass through here spend their winter in Latin America, as you can see all of these lines. And so if you're removing habitat in places like California or places like Mexico or Nicaragua or South America, it's all connected because birds move through these landscapes. They're not phased by borders or border walls or any type of sociopolitical boundaries that we draw around these areas. They relate from an ecosystem-based perspective. Where they breed is the same type of habitat where they spend their winter. All right, so getting back locally. So there's a lot of things to consider when constructing, designing, and maintaining a native plant garden. And so it can be pretty confusing, right? Because like I said, there's a wide variety of ecoregions in California, and I live in a certain one and I visit other ones, and folks are, as I saw in the chat, calling in from all over the state. So how do you find what grows near you? Great question. So what you can do is head over to calscape.com, which is part of the California Native Plant Society, and you can figure out what grows near you. So you can type in your location, your zip code or whatever, and then it'll pop up with a bunch of plants that grow near you. And if you're interested in a specific one, you can click on it, like this toy on. You can click through and see some images of it during different parts of the year. Obviously, this is during the winter when it has berries. On the right, you can see the range map. As we scroll down, you can see the scientific name. You can learn about the plant description, its form, growth rate, etc. What's a host species for, its water requirements, and a ton of different information that will allow you to make informed decisions about the plant. So birds of California, right? So this is the marriage between birds and plants. So California is pretty incredible. We have just over 700 species of birds observed in California. That doesn't mean that they all live here year round. There are some that have been reported here as vagrants, which means they're very rare and they usually don't show up here. But in general, California is second to Texas in the US for diversity, so it is not slacking by any means. And like I said before, much of our habitat has been destroyed, dismantled, and otherwise degraded, which has resulted in the classification of 16 species as endangered, everything from the Belding savanna sparrow, which is a unique subspecies, to the least Bell's vireo, elf owl, et cetera, and we have about 8 species that are state threatened. And you can revisit this presentation later online if you'd like to take screenshots, or you can do so while I'm moving through it. So birds of California, what kind of birds you want in your garden? Well, part of it to decide depends on what you plant and what kind of space you have and what habitats you're adjacent to. This is our charismatic California scrub jay, which is widespread throughout much of the state, as well as the arroyo willow. And so it's pretty straightforward. If you want birds to come, you got to feed them, you got to house them, basically like a bee and Airbnb. So we're going to move through some different classifications of birds to kind of get a basic understanding of different groups so you can kind of identify what's going on in your backyard. And then we're going to move into some more design aspects of gardening. So this is a red-tailed hawk. It's a raptor. As you can see, it's got long talons. You can't really see the hook beak from here. And if you were looking at it from above, you could see that it has a red tail depending on its age. This is probably our most common large raptor that we see. Another common one that we see in oak woodlands and adjacent habitats are the red-shouldered hawk. As you can see, has a much more rufous color to it, but it's also got this hooked beak for tearing flesh, and they're pretty incredible. Another raptor that we probably will see most often in the garden is the Cooper's hawk. The Cooper's hawks are a good sign that you have birds in your yard, because these guys, gals, love eating birds. They're basically bird loving fiends. They snack on birds like it's their job. They're agile, and they make up a different group of hawks called accipiters, with generally a little bit shorter and more narrow wings, which allows for more agile flying. Then as we move forward into woodpeckers, we've got a smattering of woodpeckers, including the northern flicker, pileated woodpecker, which is our largest woodpecker in California, found in the hardwoods and redwood forests. We also have a white-headed woodpecker, which is found in the Sierra and some of the transverse mountain ranges here in Southern California. Nuttall's woodpecker, which is, I believe, mostly a Southern California species. And then next up, we've got a variety of different hummingbird species. And hummingbirds love tubular flowers. And like I said, we're going to dive into stuff later. Here's an Allen's hummingbird with a mostly green back and an orange kind of rusty sides, feeding on a golden currant. Anna's hummingbird. These are probably one of the most easily identified hummingbird species throughout California. They're all throughout the state, even sometimes up into the elevation of snowpack. And they have got a bright pink fuchsia gorget, which is the iridescent feathers on the head, and an all green back, at least the males do. And here's kind of a side profile of this. So you can see kind of the iridescent feathers on the back, and then part of the gorget and the iridescent feathers on the head are currently glowing here and you can see it's perched on some mule fat. This is a Costa's hummingbird. It's got more of a purple gorget and a green back. And moving into flycatchers, these are really cool birds. We've got quite a few in California. This is an ash-throated flycatcher feeding on a sphingid moth. Black phoebes, these are probably the most common flycatcher you'll see in your garden or in your neighborhood or out and about. They're residents here in California. They're year-round. They generally aren't migratory, and they are very formal. As you can see, they always have their tuxedo on. Flycatchers, as their name alludes to, catch insects, not just flies, but they won't turn down a good meal. Another one of the charismatic flycatchers we have in California is the vermilion flycatcher. These birds were normally found mostly in southeast Arizona and around the Patagonia area, but in recent years, their population has been expanding northward, and now you can actually see them in Los Angeles County. Ruby-crowned kinglet, these are really awesome, especially during this time of year. These guys generally breed in higher elevations or in northern latitudes, and they come down for the winter. They make a kind of an interesting little call, and if a small jumping bird is in the trees and you can't get a good look out of it, there's probably 1 in 2 chance that it's a ruby-crowned kinglet. Don't be sad if you don't see the ruby crown. That's kind of hard to see, and it's only in males. Continuing into, so these are insectivorous birds. So I forgot to mention, if you look at the beak, it's very thin, narrow, and tweezer-like. It's similar to a woodpecker, but it's much more dainty, and it's not used for drilling into bark necessarily. Another insectivorous bird is from a group of birds called warblers. As you can see, very similar beak, small body, thin legs, very kind of flighty. These are a type of warbler. Nashville warbler on a willow, looking for insects. Yellow rump warbler is another overwintering species here in the lowlands, but it also breeds in our coniferous pine forest at higher elevation. And here it is in the winter feeding on dried poison oak berries. So don't be upset if you see poison oak. Remember that humans are the only species that are negatively impacted by poison oak oils. Most other animals use it for habitat or food, as you can see here. Another warbler species that we'll talk about is the Townsend's warbler. It's kind of like a bumblebee warbler, black kind of facial patterns with yellow around it, some wing bars, foraging through some coyote brush. Another insectivorous bird is a blue-gray gnatcatcher, perched on some big saltbush, Atriplex. And these guys are really awesome as well. And who doesn't love bush tits? These guys flock around in the wintertime in large groups, passing through often oak woodlands and gardens and things like that. And during the spring, they pair off. How are we doing? Good. All right, so house wren. This is, as the name alludes to, a type of wren that is often found near human dwellings and habitations. They're very cute. These guys are kind of omnivorous, but they also kind of favor insects. Another group of birds we're going to talk about are like sparrows or Bearsidae family. cardinalidae kind of coming up. So this is the spotted towhee perched on a coast live oak recovering from a burn. And these birds are kind of omnivorous in the sense that they eat both insects, berries, and seeds, just like the black-headed grosbeak, also beautiful bird, migratory. House finch, probably the most common backyard bird in addition to the black phoebe. These guys get their color from their food. So a healthy house finch, at least a male, will have bright colors ranging anywhere from peachy orange to kind of a fire truck red. California towhee is also a very common backyard bird. As you can see, these birds, all these seed-eating birds have triangular conical bills used for cracking seeds. And these guys also shuffle through the duff. So sometimes if you hear kind of scratching, it might be a California towhee. So here's how they forage. Another common backyard bird is the lesser goldfinch. And as you can see, these guys love laurel sumac as well. And they're a great shrubland plant to cultivate for habitat as well as for birds to eat. Song sparrow, again, you can see these birds all look very similar in terms of their beak. White crowned sparrow, same goes for that one. Mourning doves, these are also extremely common in the backyard. These guys are omnivorous. They'll take seeds, berries, and sometimes insects as well. They're mostly seen foraging on the ground. California quail, our state bird. I'm sure most folks are familiar with this species. You may hear it calling from a variety of habitats, but mostly shrublands. Chicago, Chicago. These guys or gals were once found in coveys up to 1,000 strong before colonization. And now it's kind of a rare occasion if you see a group of more than 20 or 30 individuals. Western bluebird, these birds took a hit, but with recent success, a lot of them are coming back as conservation-minded organizations are using bird feeder boxes to create artificial nesting locations for them. California thrasher, this is a unique bird found in a lot of shrubland habitat. And as you can see, it's got a really cool curved beak and it's got an incredible song. It's a type of mimic. So keep your ears out for those guys during this time of year and the spring. Wren tit, this is the bouncy ball bird of the chaparral. It sounds like beep, 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 beep. Often heard calling during the early morning and right before sunset. Hooded oriole, this is an omnivorous, this is a mostly frugivorous bird that's migratory. As you can see, it's very tropical in color, and that's because it originates from the tropics. Costas hummingbird, feeding on Centupa rosa. All right, so we went over a variety of different kind of standard birds that we can see in California, and now we want to get our garden going. So there's a lot to consider, and we'll talk about a lot of those factors this evening. So plant selection. Well, when you want to select plants, there's a lot to consider. A couple main things that I encourage folks to consider is, the first is creating texture and dimension. The second is creating a color palette, and the big takeaway is that we want to focus for year-round activity. I'm not going to leave you with that, of course. We're going to talk a little bit about that. However, some of the common mistakes that I think is critical to call out is the collector's garden. Now, just because you have an INAT list or an INAT species list of 500 or 700 species of plants doesn't mean that your garden's going to be better off with, 500 species of plants. It's better to focus on a couple different things rather than going crazy in terms of diversity. Common mistake is overplanting. As you know, plants grow. A one-year-old plant, a one-year-old coast live oak looks dramatically different than a 200-year coast live oak plant. So keep that in mind as you plant. Another thing is that people often forget to provide enough contrast between plants. And what I mean by that is overall size and shape, leaf structure, leaf size, right? We want to provide a nice contrast that's aesthetically pleasing. Another thing is designing flower color, designing by flower color. Okay, that's cool, but there also needs to be some more structural components to a garden design than just for color, according to many landscape designers. Another common mistake is not creating conditions for the plants to thrive, which includes mixing different hydrozones, which we'll define shortly. And then another easy one is not maintaining the garden. So a couple of things to consider in terms of design concepts: the rule of odd numbers, massing, layering, repetition, contrast, function, and we'll go over one more time because I thought there was one last one. So you can take a picture of this. They're pretty self-explanatory. And if you are working with like a landscape designer or something like that, y'all can talk about that. And if they're not talking about these things, you might want to find yourself a different person to work with. All right, hydrozoning. It's different than AutoZone, but you can still get in the hydrozone. All right, so basically hydrozoning is grouping plants into hydrozones, which is basically an approach to irrigation. Okay, this is about irrigation and how much water plants need or will tolerate. So depending on what type of plants you're selecting for, and you can see the information about this on Calscape, or if you visit your local native plant nursery or local growing co-op, etc., you can ascertain what water regimen plants, California native plants like. In general, after about 1 year, California native plants, once they're established, do not need hand watering or any type of irrigation. That's kind of the upside. So like I said, effective hydrozoning will maximize plant success as well as ensure that plants aren't over or underwatered. Alrighty, so now we're getting into a little bit of these design aspects. So bones, okay? This is not crazy, but it's pretty awesome. So it's basically a hardscape that is both attractive, bold, and functional. So as you can see here, some of this flagstone provides a nice natural kind of hardscape that provides contrast between other parts of the garden. Bones don't exclusively have to be hardscape, like this manzanita, which has some incredible branching structure. These can also serve as ways to anchor the garden and draw the eye. The guts, okay, this is a term that's kind of silly, but it's basically like hardworking and outstanding perennials that are going to be there day in, day out. And like I said, depending on the latitude and the location, some annuals can transition into perennials, like California poppy. Elegant Clarkia is an annual, but you'll see some more perennials soon. The skin, okay, so the skin of the garden is basically what ties it all together. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use ground cover, like yarrow, which is an incredible pollinator plant, incredible medicine. It's just freaking cool. I'm obsessed with yarrow. You can see some coyote mint, some monardella grown in here as well. And then you can also use this Ceanothus. Ceanothus is a really cool ground cover. There aren't a ton of different like great garden ground covers that are non-cultivars that I'm familiar with. You can learn a lot more than I do. I'm not like a crazy expert. But in general, I try to stay away from cultivars because I think natural genetics are better. And, you know, if we want to support native habitats, then we should use genetics that are from natural environments. You can see some Santa Cruz Island red buckwheat, I believe, here. And then this is Ceanothus centennial, but regardless, the skin is basically ground covers that tie the garden together. Accents, okay, so accents are pretty straightforward. They're focal points to draw the eye. And you can use water features or just interesting different garden pieces to kind of bring the eye in, right? We're talking about aesthetics and functionality here. All right, so we kind of went over some design basics to keep in mind. Now, the next thing that we want to talk about is planting, right? You can't just throw plants in the ground. Well, you could, but you might not know what the success is. And with the cost of doing these types of things, it's important to invest a little bit of time and resources up front to get a better picture of what's going on under the surface. Because like I said before, it's an ecosystem-based approach. Say that with me, ecosystem-based approach. And so if we leave out soil, we're leaving out an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. So you can do, and I'll go through a variety of different ways that you can kind of ascertain what's going on with the soil and how well it's doing and what its composition is. So you can do different soil tests. So this is kind of like a soil composition test. And so you can basically dig straight down. You can see different horizons. Generally speaking, you're not going to be digging past like the O, the A, or the B horizon. But as you can see, different soil levels, these different soil horizons have different components to them and are often composed of different things. Another important way to test your soil is through the ribbon test. This is not wrapping presents. This is basically to see what's up with your soil, right? We often have a triangle. It's a continuum between sand, silt, and clay. And so to do a ribbon test, it's pretty easy. You don't need a whole lot of anything other than some soil in your hand and some water. So step one, moisten a bit of soil in your hand and knead it to remove dry clumps. The second thing is to roll it into a tube shape and then squeeze the ribbon upwards between your thumb and forefinger to form the longest, thinnest ribbon possible. Stand it kind of straight upright as you push it out, and then measure where it breaks off. So if it's about an inch, if it breaks off at about 1 inch, it's sand. If it's about 2 inches, it's mostly silt. If it's 3 inches, it's clay. And so here's kind of a visual diagram to see like the ribbon length in millimeters and then how that corresponds to the soil composition. And like I said, soil with high silt content will form flakes or peel instead of forming a ribbon. The longer and thinner the ribbon, the higher percentage of clay. Cool. The next thing you can also do is called a jar test. It's pretty cool. Grab a mason jar, fill it 1/3 full of soil, 2/3 full of water, shake it up, and you can draw lines at different time points and then just set it and leave it be. So as you can see, as it separates, there's organic matter or OM that flows to the top, then the water is next, and then the clay, the silt, the sand. So some of these settle obviously at different timelines. So after about a minute, the sand will settle out. After about an hour, the silt. After about 2 days, clay, and then organic material will flow to the top. Another way to do a soil test is through a drainage or percolation test. So basically you just dig a hole about 6 inches or 12 inches deep, and then you place a ruler or a yardstick in the bottom of the hole, fill the hole with water several times to saturate the soil, and then note the time, fill the hole with water, and then when the hole is empty, calculate how long it took for the soil to drain. And so soils that are super clay heavy drain really slowly. And so certain plants have certain requirements, which you can learn more about on Calscape. So this is a great way to see what's going on in the soil and how fast it drains. Another thing to consider are professional labs, okay? Because there's some things that you can't understand from the aforementioned test. So you can do chemical testing for soil fertility, pH, and more. And so here's a great website to look for soil testing laboratories where you can send in your soil. Another thing that often goes under the radar is biological testing for fungi, bacteria, and nematodes. And so here's a variety of different resources you can use to get these types of tests done for your soil. And the takeaway here is that just like above ground situations, below ground situations are a whole thriving ecosystem as well. Everything from fungi to bacteria to mycorrhizae, nematodes, earthworms, everybody's connected. And so if you want to feed the plants, you got to feed the soil. And there's ways to do this. You can use organic fertilizers, you can use mycorrhizae, compost, sheet mulch, aerobically activated compost tea. These are pretty awesome. This is basically, I'll let you guys look it up. It's kind of beyond the scope of tonight. Another way that you can get things popping in the garden is with water. Now, California has an interesting history with water, but ultimately we've lost a lot of our creeks, natural streams, rivulets, arroyos, and things like that due to development. And so it's important to bring water into the garden, A, because it's cool and birds love it, and water features. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you can do that. The most important thing to consider is that for birds to access the water, they generally like a shallow dish so they can bathe and that they don't have to get their clothes wet. No, they just don't like to go in deep water. And so I recommend using kind of flat dishes. It's also best if the water's moving. And so there's a variety of different options that you can look up on the internet. And as you can see, all these eastern warblers are having a freaking bath. And here's a cool little thing. This is a water wiggler. So if you want to keep it simple, you can just grab this little battery powered thing and it wiggles the water and it basically discourages mosquito larvae from laying eggs. All right, so you're fired up. You love the presentation. It's been one of the best presentations you've seen of the evening. And you're like, all right, now I need to grab some plants. Well, there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that. One of the ways is you can purchase plants from a nursery. Again, Calscape is an incredible resource, and so you can search for nurseries near you. Another great way you can do that is growing from seed. This is fun. It's low cost. It increases the genetic diversity, deepens your individual connection to the plant life cycle, and ensures your native plants aren't covered in pesticides and insecticides. Two things I want to call out here that I think are important to state. And I also want to call out that a lot of this stuff that I've learned over the last couple of years is from a friend of mine, Nicholas Hummingbird. He's an Indigenous educator who lives in Southern California, and I'll plug him in the next couple of slides so you can learn more about him. But one of the things that's important about growing from seed is that it increases genetic diversity. A lot of the plants that you get from nurseries perhaps are actually just cuttings or clones from a host plant. And as the name suggests, a clone basically has the exact same genetic makeup as the host plant. So from it's basically the same thing as monoculture to polyculture, right? In a mixed ecological system, there's plants and animals of different genetic makeup, which allows for overall population and ecosystem health. It's kind of beyond the scope of tonight's talk, but it's important to note that a lot of don't get greenwashed. And then the other important part is that by growing from seed, you can ensure your plants aren't covered in pesticides and insecticides. It's kind of mind-boggling because when we think about native plants, we think like they're all good, organic, peace, love, whatever. However, that's not necessarily the case. So this is a published paper from 2021, Pollinators and Plant Nurseries, How Irrigation and Pesticide Treatment of Native Ornamental Plants Impact Solitary Bees. It's also important to call out that the European honeybee is not a native species. It is wildly invasive. It produces honey. Yeah, that's great and awesome. But there are like literally hundreds, if not more, species of native bees in California, many of which are solitary and have very important relationships with native plants, and they've been outcompeted by European honeybees. So let us all call out that be aware that nurseries, even those producing pollinator plants, may have treated their plants with pesticides. Growers are very sensitive consumer intolerance for plant damage, and sometimes states mandate pesticide applications to prevent the spread of certain pests. Toxic levels of insecticides and high levels of fungicides have been detected in nursery plants repeatedly. Unfortunately, bees and butterflies may encounter risks from the commonplace use of pesticides during plant production, which can leave residues on or in plants. This includes California native plants. If you want to learn more about this, you can visit the Xerxes Society. Here's a link to learning about bee-safe plants. All right, avoiding cultivars. This is a big thing I learned from Nicholas as well. And so cultivars are aesthetically pretty cool. However, they are basically domestic animals of the plant world. They've been manipulated for botanical use in horticultural practices. They do not maintain natural genetics, and they've been modified for like the home and garden. Natural genetics are amazing. They're the true genetics, right? If you want to support native plant and native ecosystems, native insects, let's use the plants that have evolved here for thousands of years, not ones that we've manipulated for specific horticultural uses. That's kind of a contentious topic, and I'm sure people probably feel mixed about that. I'm not here to judge, blame, or shame anybody, but it is important to note that. All right, the homie Nicholas. So Nicholas is pretty amazing, to say the least, and you can get your seeds from him. He's mostly active on Instagram, and he's got a book coming out soon, and he's been featured in a lot of incredible Indigenous resources and other publications, and you can get a bunch of different plants from him. These are just a small assortment of screenshots from his seeds that I've taken screenshots of to share with y'all. And he also has incredible classes. He's also hosting a 4-part California gardening class. Excuse me, and you can learn about that from checking out his Instagram. And California is freaking amazing. We have so many different plants to choose from. So from buckwheats to Canterbury bells to different poppies. The big takeaway here is that we want to plant for year-round benefits, no matter what you're thinking about, right? This fuchsia flowered gooseberry, aka Ribes speciosum, flowers in the winter/spring, which is great for pollinators and hummingbirds. And then in the summertime, it produces amazing gooseberries for other species of birds and animals. This same plant throughout the course of 1 year. As you can see, here's the Anna's hummingbird hitting it in winter/early spring. Another thing that's really cool is that bladderpod, depending where you live, is a great regionally appropriate plant because it also blooms year-round, which is awesome because you can see insects and birds visiting it throughout the year. And in the wintertime, like toyon is a plant that actually is one of the only indigenous plants of California that retained its indigenous name. Toyon, I think it's from the Ohlone people of Central California. We just hit 45 minutes, so I'm going to pump through this. And this plant produces berries in the wintertime, which is a nice bumper crop for a lot of winter resident species like American robins and cedar waxwings. A lot of this stuff's been floating around social media the last little bit of these birds feasting on toyon. And so this is a great plant to cultivate. And so just to emphasize this point a little bit further, you want to plant your garden so that it flowers and produces resources all year round. And so these are certain species that in my area in Southern California generally flower between January through March: currants and gooseberries, cacti, monkey flowers, etc. And then during the summer months in my area, we've got all kinds of different things that bloom. So it's important to keep in mind that when you're selecting your garden, that you keep this in mind. Bird feeders. This is a great question. Everybody always wants to know about it. Bird feeders are great. I'm not going to say a ton about it during this. I'm sure folks will want to ask some questions about it. This is the cost of hummingbird coming to a bird feeder. So bird feeders are great for the garden. They're a great way to initially attract birds. When the birds come in, they sing, they chat, and then the other birds are eavesdropping, they sing, they chat. And if you have native species in the garden, the birds can check it out. It's basically like those big white lights that they put up in the sky to promote things. A bird feeder can more or less function in the same way for your yard. As you can see, there's a ton of different feeders, everything from the squirrel proof feeders, the Squirrel Buster 6.0. There's bark butter feeders, oriole feeders, window feeders, tray feeders, hopper feeders, finch feeders, hummingbird feeders, suet feeders. The list goes on. No, actually, there's probably not a whole lot more than this, but regardless, feeders are cool. And some folks obviously are not privileged to have like a ton of space to garden, or maybe even any space to garden, but that can also happen on a small scale. Nicholas Hummingbird offers awesome container gardening classes, which is a whole different art in and of itself. And this California flannel bush was doing pretty well in the container as well. And like I said, it's an ecosystem-based approach. So if we want to support birds, bring them to their garden, we want to support the ecosystem, it's all connected, right? So this desert globe mallow with this little jumping spider, got a lemonade berry with like a tree cricket on there. Everybody's benefiting. And one of my favorite plants that provides year-round benefits in my region is black sage. It is like catnip for humans. It smells good. It's got a variety of medicinal properties. It's part of the mint family, as I'm sure most people know. Square stems, hairy, pubescent stems, lavender, white, purple, tubular flowers, and opposite leaves as well. And so this is like spring, kind of late winter flower period. And then during the dormancy period, or the summer in Southern California, where it's much hotter, drier, much less rain, it goes to basically a bird feeder. And so these are chia seeds, black sage seeds, which are extremely similar to chia, and birds love these. I love them. I love birds. It's pretty amazing. All right. So as you can see, California has a fantastic diversity of species, everything from perennials, annuals, lilies, which are some of my favorite, and I'm sure many of y'all's favorites as well. But one plant that I would be remiss that I didn't mention are oaks and acorns, okay? It's a coast live oak. These are acorns. These are acorn woodpeckers. They go together hand in hand. I'm sure most of you have heard the story. Acorn woodpeckers collect and store these during the non-acorn season so they can access them in their granaries. This is the acorn woodpecker up close. And the California scrub jay didn't get a lot of love yet in this presentation, but here's a little GIF I made of the role that California scrub jays play in reforestation. So scrub jays are incredibly intelligent. They're part of the corvid family, which are jays, crows, ravens, etc. And these birds love to get the acorns from the oak tree, and they run off or fly off with them, and then they go bury them and hide them so they can get them in the winter. Now, jays have incredible spatial memory. However, it's not perfect, and sometimes the acorns get forgotten. And so where they plant it in the nice loamy soil, eventually an oak tree will sprout from there and continue to grow. These guys and gals are some of the best reforesters, especially in areas following a burn. California scrub jays will do an amazing job reforesting it. So if you remember nothing from tonight's talk, remember that when we're gardening with natives, we want to take an ecosystem-based approach. We're not trying to manipulate the environment towards our needs. We're trying to restore the ecological functions that have been here for time immemorial. And as you can see from this photo in Griffith Park, that there's a lot of ecosystem. And so a lot of our cities now contain almost exclusively non-native plants. And so it's up to us to bridge this gap between some of these natural landscapes, the urban, suburban, and otherwise, and connecting them back to natural spaces like coastal dune habitat, etc. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Birds by Beaches, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Wow, thank you so much for that presentation.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so we've had some questions. I think I found Nicholas's Instagram. A lot of folks were asking for that. Is
Cool.
it California? It's California native plants, right? Just like
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's his public one for,
Okay.
I'll put it up here too.
Yeah. And let's see. Someone asked about pesticide use, including perimeter sprays and the effects on birds. I know you talked about bird feeders. Thanks for a lot of folks for asking about that. And about, I feel like maybe talking more about bird feeders. It seems like it's a little bit of a contentious topic.
Contentious topic. I'm happy to get into it.
Yeah. And like I said in the beginning, this is all being recorded. So I know, you went through kind of quickly on some of the things, but it's all being recorded, so you all have access to it after. And
I did cover a lot, and
no, it was
covered a
great.
lot.
It was an amazing presentation. Everyone's like in awe of all the information you shared. So no, it's great.
Here we go.
And
Here's
yeah,
Nick's.
awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people wanted that. Okay, so California native plants, great.
He is, and he is probably one of the most impactful educators I've had in my adult life, at least like post-college. He has blown my mind open to a whole different way of thinking about the environment and colonization and native plants and indigenous people's relationship to the landscape. So I encourage you to sign up for all his classes, get consultations, like go big.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you really covered a lot. So I think we can call it. I mean, yeah, I don't really have too many questions. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think, people, so the only way to contact him is on Instagram, huh?
Yeah, right now, I think I was asking him what's up with the website thing. That may happen, but I would, if you want to get a hold of Nick, get on Instagram.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming and tuning in, and see you all next month. I think, let me see what our next month's, it'll be on, I think we're doing it on growing good food. So that'll be exciting too. And then we're going to have one on growing flowers too in April. So that'll be fun as well.
Heck yeah.
So, thank you all so much and have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maya.